Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to show you 4 different examples of a Type 18C sword. It's a big, wide, imposing sword, and I have 3 mass production pieces and 1 custom iteration that are in my house right now, and so I'm going to share them with you, contrast some of the quality differences and construction differences, and hopefully give you an idea of where you want to spend your money and give you a chance to look and see these swords sitting next to each other so we can contrast the feel. It's going to be kind of a dull, wordy video, but hopefully you take some enjoyment from it. Do know before I go on with the show that I'm not an expert in historic European martial arts or in swords in general. I'm a collector and enthusiast, but that doesn't make me knowledgeable. Having lots of things doesn't mean you know lots of things, so take what I say with a grain of salt. Also know that the Albion and the Ronin that you're about to see are second-hand. The Dark Sword Armory is a prototype, and the custom iteration is a kind of one-of-a-kind special piece. So there's some variables to take into account that these pieces may not be representative exactly of what you would expect to buy, where you'd buy one from the manufacturer or custom maker. Keep that in mind as well. Anyway, I'm going to show you in contrast and do all of this stuff, so here we go. These are the 4 swords that we will be comparing today, and I'm going to name off what they are, and then we'll start with the pommels as we compare and contrast them. But for namesake, we'll introduce them all. This is the Ronin Katana War Sword number 3, version 2. This sword retails, I believe, for $450, though it can be seen for $350 depending on where you're Googling it. Anyway, it's over $300, maybe $450. It, I suppose, depends. It comes with a scabbard that is wooden core, and you can see that basically it draws a lot of influence from the sword at the Met, or the Harriet Dean sword, or the swords found in the Alexandria Armory of the Oakeshott Type 18C variety. It has the Arabic etching in it, similar to the sword it draws its historical influence from. Obviously, none of these, I don't think, are meant to be historic museum recreations of the exact sword, neither proportionally nor length, but they all draw some influence from those swords found in the Alexandria Armory. Anyway, without going into history, because I suck at it, I'm just going to continue introducing them. Again, Ronin Katana War Sword number 3, version 2. Version 1, as a side note, doesn't have this Arabic inscription on it, but is otherwise the same thing. This is the Dark Sword Armory Alexandria, or the Alexandria Sword by Dark Sword Armory. There supposedly will be a piece with the same kind of etching in it as the Ronin sword does. This is a prototype, though, provided by Dark Sword Armory. This variety would retail for $580, which is a sharp version, including a scabbard. If you don't want it sharp or don't want the belt system with the scabbard, the prices will go down. This is the more expensive variety of it with the sharp iteration and the scabbard and the belt on the scabbard. Anyway, test sample, prototype sample from Dark Sword Armory. That's what this one is right here. This is the Albion, the Alexandria, or the Alexandria Sword by Albion. Albion and Dark Sword Armory obviously share the same name. That is a different subject for a different video. I'm sure it will cause some controversy, but nevertheless, they were obviously both very inspired by the swords found in the Alexandria Armory, and they both have chosen to name their sword the Alexandria, at least of this typology. So this is the Alexandria Sword by Albion. I believe they're a little over $1,200 right now, not including the scabbard. It is just the sword by itself. This one has a little coin inset in the pommel. I don't think that is going to very dramatically alter the weight, though I received it with this coin in here, and all of the measurements that I've taken include the coin. So note that this is the Alexandria piece by Albion. And this is a custom sword by Lucas Masselgoer, massacring the gentleman's name, but I've done a review and a little bit of an interview with him discussing the sword and his kind of theories around sword crafting. And this sword is obviously draws some influence from it, but it's different, has a much longer grip than the varieties in a Fishtail Pommel, so different, not necessarily trying to copy the wheel pommel pieces. It's a different variety, but a custom sword. Now this one was over $4,000 with the scabbard. The scabbard was a sold separately ordeal, but the total package, including the scabbard for this one, was around $4,000. So as we examine it, we go from $450, $580, $1,200 to $4,000 something. This included a scabbard. The Albion is the only iteration of this sword that did not include a scabbard, though you could have one made. Presumably it would cost, between $500 and $1,000, depending on how bedazzled. You could obviously make it more bedazzled, and that would probably put it closer to the $2,000 price mark if we were to include a scabbard of similar quality level to the sword, without going overzealous on the decoration and adornments on the scabbard itself. Anyway, there's the swords in introduction, and I've also produced a video on all of them, with the exception of the Dark Sword Armory video. I did an initial impressions video on this. The others all have a review that shows cutting and my thoughts and blah 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 about each one. So if you're interested, there will be a link in the description down below for you to follow up with that. Sword friends, as you know, I am a shit student of history, but it just so happens I know somebody who is not, that can share some interesting tidbits about the Type 18C sword, and may have some contributions to make to this fun video, so I hope you enjoy some thoughts from I Post Swords. Sword friend Sebastian is going to tell us about the Type 18C.
Hello, I'm I Post Swords, here to join you on Matthew Jensen's channel to talk about the European Type 18C medieval sword. Because I'm not a historian, I'm going to be relying heavily on sources by people like you at Oakeshott and on the Klingen Museum based in Solingen. On the Type 18C, Oakeshott mentions it in multiple texts, and he says that it is overall a general purpose blade capable of both cutting and thrusting. He says in multiple texts that they normally feature a flattened diamond cross-section, although some feature what is more akin to a flattened hexagonal cross-section. Across all the Type 18Cs, he notes that they have a central ridge, and yet are still relatively flexible. This is because they sacrifice some of their thrusting capacity to aid in increased cutting ability. A more flexible sword with a thinner cross-section is more capable of getting through a target as it endures less resistance in the cut. Perhaps the most famous Type 18C is the Alexandria arsenal swords that are found in the Metropolitan Museum, and the one which was recently sold that belonged to Harriet Dean. The Bashford Dean and Harriet Dean Alexandrias both come from a type that Ewart Oakeshott mentions in The Archaeology of Weapons. In this book, he states that there were many swords that were taken being 14th or 15th century types and had Arabic inscriptions applied to them. These were deposited in the arsenal of Alexandria, and some of them may have been acquired by trade, while others were taken as war tribute, mostly from Cyprus. In the same book, he states that the Type 18 is a general all-purpose blade, which varies a good deal in the shape of the blade's outline, as well as in the hilt styles and components. In The Sword in the Age of Chivalry, Oakeshott says that the Type 18C subcategory features a broad, heavy blade of flattened diamond section. The face is nearly always flat or slightly convex. They are generally around 30 to 34 inches long, and the grip is also rather long, with some grips similar to the waisted style seen in other Type 18s. As these swords are large hand-and-a-half weapons, the swelling of this waisted grip is often closer to the cross than to the pommel. The pommel is generally one of the wheel type shapes, however, not necessarily, as we see a large variation between the pommels and crossguards on these swords. In his concluding remarks on the Type 18C, Oakeshott says that they are generally Italian swords and that survivors are exceptionally rare, despite the relative popularity of the sword in art. For example, we see several examples of the Type 18C in French manuscripts from the time. In his seminal book on the topic, in which he establishes in detail his entire typology, Records of the Medieval Sword, Oakeshott has several examples of what we would now call the Type 18C. However, in this book, they are labelled Type 18A, as is the entire chapter. In the beginning of the chapter, Oakeshott defines the Type 18B as a very long-gripped bastard sword, and the Type 18C as a shorter-gripped bastard sword. The examples of the Type 18C that Oakeshott gives on page 188 and 189 are both of the typical style, with the broad flattened cross-sections, and the wasted hand-and-a-half grips. One of them is only a drawing. However, in this drawing, which he says is a copy of a photo from a Sotheby's sale, there is shading which indicates that it may have been concave ground, a little bit hollow ground, rather than having a convex shape. However, as it is not a photograph, we cannot say that definitively. He also does not discuss it in his short description. The other sword he shows is a Metropolitan Museum of Art example, however it is neither the Bashford nor Harriet Dean sword, but another Type 18C. Of this sword, he says that the hilt would typify it as a Type 15A. However, the extremely broad blade differentiates it from them and makes it a Type 18C, showing the logic behind his categorization. Oakeshott notes that while this sword was initially dated to 1400 to 1425, It is more likely from 1350 to 1400, and was misdated due to the early way that these swords were dated in his time, which brings us to the need for a more current text on the topic. In The Sword, Form and Thought, published by the Solingen Blade Museum, we see on page 90 that there is another Type 18C. They say that while it looks broad and crude, having a heavy, sturdy appearance, it is in fact the very opposite. The point of percussion on the blade is only 1.7mm thick, although we do have to correct for the level of corrosion. They say that this blade would have been flexible and agile, but not particularly well suited to the bind, lacking stiffness. It would have been a very powerful cutting sword, not perfectly suited to the thrust, as that particular example had a rather spatulated tip, although again it does have losses due to substantial corrosion. It is therefore safe to say that you at Oakeshott, and indeed modern historians, have a very strict classification of the Type 18C, being a hand-and-a-half length sword, both in blade and grip, which has an exceptionally broad, flattened diamond blade. However, I would argue that there is another style of sword which could be considered of the Type 18C, which does not feature that typical flattened diamond cross-section, and that is swords like the Wallace Collection A479. The A479, which you may recognise from a video by Todd Stuff, is a sword which features an extremely pronounced reinforcing midrib. In fact, according to a post on my Armory by Todd himself, it was around 10mm thick at the ricasso and had only a minimal level of distal taper. This would make this sword exceptionally stiff, fixing one of the issues that we see in the example in A Sword, Form and Thought. This exceptionally stiff mid-ribbed blade featured very fine edges, in the style that you see typically with a reinforcing midridge. Because this blade is very broad and is of around the length that the Type 18C generally is, we can say that it fulfills the same criteria as a Type 18C, even if it does not fulfill the same design. It has the same philosophy of design behind it, being a broad cut and thrust sword, although in that case it is more biased towards the thrust due to its reinforcing midrib. It also has an extremely strong concave edge geometry, rather than the slightly convex geometry that we see in the typical Type 18C, according to Oakeshott. It's also worth noting that this example, the A479 in the Wallace collection, has had its grip replaced sometime probably around the 19th century by the museum curators at the Wallace collection, which is famously known as a collection of sword blades and sword hilts put together rather than of complete original swords. The Wallace collection A479 is therefore not a true Type 18C. However, it could be considered a subgroup of the Type 18C, being similar in both form and function, in the Dark Sword Armory offering some of that same philosophy coming through. By using a hollow ground, or in this case, double-fulled section, the Dark Sword Armory manages to maintain stiffness while reducing weight. This is slightly different to the A479, which uses a central midrib to increase stiffness while also slightly increasing weight. It is not used to lower or maintain the same weight, but instead in order to increase stiffness. So we can say that the Dark Sword Armory example falls somewhere between the typical flattened cross-section that we see on the Type 18C and on the reinforcing midrib style that we see on the A479. This cross-section has several benefits. In the instance where you maintain the same thickness or increase the thickness of the blade, it can be used to reinforce the stiffness of the blade. For a sword as broad and as long as the Type 18C, I can see a strong argument, especially in the modern reproduction market, of fullering a blade of this style, while preserving the exact same edge geometry. This reduces the weight of the sword, while maintaining all of its functionality. The Type 18C has a very strict historical definition in terms of the extant examples that fit the Oakeshott typology, requiring a flattened diamond cross-section. However, that's not to say that the style of the Type 18C must adhere to that on the reproduction market. Some level of artistic interpretation must be allowed if people are allowed to have differing styles of swords. Otherwise, everyone is going to copy the Bashford Dean or Harriet Dean swords, being the best known Type 18Cs. and we can see this from both Ronin and Albion Swords, who've used that exact Metropolitan Museum example as the basis of their design. I rather appreciate Darksword Armory using a slightly different design, although it is done with some historical artistic interpretation. While I'd like to see the blade becoming thicker and using a more pronounced reinforcing midrib like the A479, I can understand their use of slightly thinner blade stock and going for a similar blade geometry to the typical Type 18C. Their design choice allows for a lighter blade without significantly impacting stiffness, and makes sense given the context of the modern production market. As I said, I am not a historian. However, Oakeshott was, and we should probably take his word for it, and therefore a truly authentic reproduction would have a flattened diamond cross-section, and for that, buyers need look only at Albion, Ronin, and other people custom making swords of this type. In fact, well-renowned scholars and blacksmiths like Peter Johnson have made Type 18Cs in the style of the Alexandria. However, you're going to have to stretch your budget up to $5,000 to even look in that direction. The DSA is therefore a slight fantasy historically inspired sword, which is based off actual historical examples, although not exactly. This has been iPo Swords talking about some of the details of the Type 18C in a historical context. Now, back to you, Matt.
Now we are going to look at the pommels on each of these and specifically kind of go over some of the aesthetic and quality differences between them, at least as I see it. All right, as we continue, there's a couple things that I just want to point out. First and foremost, as we look at them, we see a satin polish on all but the Darksword Armory. It has a really shiny mirror polish on it, and then obviously the little inset area here is kind of a dull satin color. This takes more effort, I should note. It's harder to potentially keep clean, but to get this kind of buffed piece with crisp, clean lines is a tricky thing to do. Doing the satin polish is less steps and potentially less money, though it doesn't necessarily make it look bad or good. It's a matter of personal preference, but it should be noted that the mirror polish is potentially a little bit more work to do and execute without tool marks. As we look at the Ronin Katana, there's a couple things I also want to note here about how this meets in terms of the transition here. Now you can see that there are some ledges. This circle meets the grip in a way that is, well, obviously the transition is maybe a little bit jarring. The circle doesn't, there are slight ledges here that could get caught on your fingers. I haven't found that to be so, but nevertheless, this little bit right here is somewhat unsightly. The Darksword Armory seems to line up pretty well. There's no gunk or anything like that on really any of the swords from the dye or glue that's used on the grip here. But the transition here looks pretty good. Transition on the Albion again is really well done, and the piece by Lucas has a very slight ledge here, though again the transition I would say is really overall quite good. The only one that's jarring, I think, in this example is the Ronin Katana, where you can see the ledges. What I specifically mean by jarring is this ledge. The ledge juts out ever so slightly over the grip, and I would like it to transition evenly and cleanly. You can imagine your hand might rest here, it could get caught on something, or if nothing else, it just looks more rugged and unfinished. Perhaps that's more historic, but nevertheless, I think it doesn't necessarily hold a candle to the other examples here in terms of the finish level on this one particular piece. Other worthy notes are the area inside this inset here. So Darksword Armory and the Ronin Katana piece all have a pretty satin-looking finish, though the Ronin looks like it's stamped out, looks a little bit more machine-made. The Darksword Armory certainly has a machine-made piece, and I can't compare that to the Albion, given that it's got a coin stuck in it, so that one gets a pass at the moment. But these two, you can see this one just has what looks like more casting imperfections in it. It looks like there's like a 6 or something stuck in here, and those same things aren't on the Darksword Armory variety. Though you could probably fit a coin of some various size in either one of these if you wanted to bedazzle it like the Albion piece here. Now the Fishtail Pommel is different than the wheel pommel, but there are some interesting bits to note about this Fishtail Pommel in that it has chamfered kind of edges along the side here. They jut off at a slight 45-degree angle to prevent you from kind of snagging yourself. It's not a sharp ledge. This is a nice crisp, clean central ridge here, and these little bits on either side are hollow ground. This has a lot of dimension to it despite its relatively simple shape and look. that really rest well in your palm and your fingers. It really allows you to get a lot of purchase on this type of pommel here. There's a lot of dimension that doesn't necessarily translate well in the simple video that you're seeing, but I talk about it more in the review of this particular sword. The wheel pommels are a little more simple. I found the Albion to actually be, it's larger, but it's also a little more slippery, and it slipped out of my hand relatively easily. So in terms of grip, I was advised to hold the grip itself rather than grip the pommel. To get extra reach, I've gripped the pommel, but moving and manhandling wet tatami mats while I use that, I found this piece to be rather slippery. Even my big sausage hands, it didn't really allow me to get a lot of purchase, and it wasn't terribly comfortable. As where these seem to rest pretty firmly in my hand, I wouldn't say they're terribly comfortable. The ledges can poke you a little bit, especially if you're swinging and your swing is met with a dull thud, but it didn't jump out of my hand the same way the Albion did. One other bit is the magnet test. You can see the Albion is certainly very magnetic. The Dark Sword Armory piece as well, magnetic. The Ronin Katana piece, whatever it is made from, it is indeed magnetic, but not to the same degree. And the piece from Lucas, same type of steel. One other way to look at these pommels is from the side, and maybe you can get a deeper appreciation of the attention to detail that can go into them and why there might be some cost differences. So the Ronin Katana being the least expensive variety, a very simple shape, it doesn't taper at all in this direction. The Dark Sword Armory piece also has a very similar, well, it's shinier and maybe takes a little bit more effort. It also has this peen block here, which arguably is another feature that takes some time and energy and effort to do. It doesn't taper, at least not discernibly, in this direction. The Albion, on the other hand, does have some taper. It's wider where it meets the grip and gradually tapers down. It angles in this direction. This doesn't necessarily have as much taper, but you're able to see some of the facets on this little fishtail pommel where they slant in, and how it has a central ridge that's preserved, and how it swells slightly in the middle and maybe even tapers down slightly towards the grip. Anyway, the more expensive varieties of swords have more facets, more attention to detail, more thought in how they fit in your hand, and there's, well, I guess just more dimension to them. Whether or not you appreciate that or are willing to pay for it, I suppose, in a broader question, just know, I suppose, that it's there. And as you contrast these next to each other, you can maybe get a better appreciation for how they differ. Now, forgive the shaky camera here, but you're able to see some of the differences in the peen area. And here you can see the Ronin Katana has just kind of been brushed over. Now this seems to be hammered on. This is compressed in there, and these pommels don't come off very easily. So that despite the fact that it doesn't look like it's kind of mushroomed out over the end, the peen section is pretty well through. That is the tang of the sword. It's been sanded over. It's compressed. It doesn't move around, but it doesn't look like a kind of mechanical connection that is holding it. The swell or whatever is holding it in must be internal. The Dark Sword Armory piece has a peen head on here, which I would say is actually really pretty well done. Maybe I can get a closer look here. It has what looks like kind of a connection. It swells over the end and is presumably holding the pommel and grip together, or at least aiding in that. The Albion peen here, simple and effective. It's a very small peen, but does what it's supposed to do. I can't get my fingernail under it. Again, for more info about this particular sword, you can watch the review I did on it. But in effect, you can see that this peen is swelled over the end of the pommel and appears to be holding it on. Unlike the Ronin piece, where it does not seem to be doing that. It's sanded over, and there's not much there that indicates that it's holding it on the same way the other peens are. It is, I guess it looks different, looks smoother. And the piece by Lucas, again, very clean. It's more uniform and even better done than the Albion piece that I would see it sitting next to. Now we're going to take a look at the grips, and there's a note on how the grips assembled, at least as I understand it. So the Ronin Katana, underneath here, there's a wooden core. It's bound in this twine, coated in leather, and then the leather is stitched. underneath the grip, there's a bunch of epoxy and resin and stuff like that that is aiding in holding this whole assembly together. And I would speculate that there is on the Dark Sword Armory and potentially on all of these swords. But I've broken some of these before, and so I've seen the guts, if you will. The Dark Sword Armory, I'm not sure how the grip is assembled, but obviously it has a kind of a smaller pattern similar to the other example shown here. The Ronin has a thicker cord. This cord is available on custom grips. I suppose you could re-grip the piece and have it done if you like this. These larger twine bits under here that you are able to feel them when you hold it in your hand, and it does seem to add a little bit more purchase to gripping the sword. I at least like the feel of these larger ribs here. This effect comes from the cord that the leather is bound in as the leather wrap is applied and then dried on the grip. It's bound in twine and it leaves impressions in here. The question is the wooden core also bound in kind of some sort of thread or twine, then applied with leather and glued the leather wrap on, and then bound in twine again while it dries? The key question there being, is there some sort of twine underneath here? Now on the Albions, it's my understanding there is not. On the piece from Lucas, it's my understanding that there is. So there's an additional structural component there that aids in the overall construction and potentially the durability of the grip, though. In pretty rare cases, I've had a grip fail. It takes a lot of gusto to get them to break, but I guess we'll find out on this one soon enough. Anyway, there's small risers on either side. I do think the Dark Sword Armory grip is pretty well done. It does have a seam on it that I can make out a little bit more easily. The Ronin has a very prominent stitched grip. It's kind of the least aesthetically pleasing side of things. It hasn't come undone on me, but it's one of those things that is cause for concern. It's kind of a weak point of the grip itself. The Albion has a seam that's very difficult to make out on it. It's wound very well in leather. The risers are really well placed. All of the little kind of linen binding areas are symmetrical and even and really well done. The piece from Lucas has some minor imperfections that kind of show its handmade nature, but overall also really, really well done. There's only some very small areas where you can make out kind of deviations in the pattern or kind of recessed areas or pockets kind of in the wood. It's all very small and very clean. In terms of shape, the Ronin obviously has a taper this way, though it would seem that there's very little taper distally on the blades at all. If I hold up the piece from Lucas as an example, you can see that there's not a significant amount of taper as we move the sword around, and that seems to be consistent across most of these blades. It doesn't taper as it moves towards the pommel. Sometimes there's a slight swell in the center, but there's not a pronounced taper on any one of these handles worthy of showing. I can say that some of the shapes are more difficult to make. Obviously the Ronin being the most simple. This is elliptical and transfers in a round, very similar on the other pieces. The Ronin is also similar in that way. The Albion is almost hexagonal. It has facets and ridges. There's a central line. It's a harder grip to execute, and honestly it feels really, really good in the hand. It's very easy to index and very easy to kind of keep your edge alignment good on. Now I gripped the pommel when I swung it around. That did not help me, but I still, even though it was uncomfortable and my hand slipped here, my primary hand held onto this really, really well, and it felt really slotted in my hand. In later cutting and just hanging onto the grip here, it's easy to hang on to. The handle is a little short for my personal taste, at least as I understand how to use these swords, though again, personal preference. The piece from Lucas is arguably the most complicated. It has this swell, tapers down to a much smaller section as it meets the fishtail. There's a lot of facets, and it's slightly rounded here, and it's not in the other places. You can watch the review on this if you want to see more detail, but I would say this is probably the most complicated shape of the grip and the hardest to execute, which I suppose, again, takes time and maybe another explanation as to why it has the price that it does. We're going to move on to the crossguard, and forgive this kind of terrible shot. It's difficult to get these all in one frame, and anyway, bitch, moan. There's a couple interesting bits to note, and first and foremost, the Dark Sword Armory piece is the only one with kind of a square guard. Now, aesthetically it looks similar, but you'll notice that these are all hexagonal. There's this strong, prominent central ridge that lies in each one of these other guards, with the exception of the Dark Sword Armory. It comes up to a swell, similar to the Dark Sword. It's met with this kind of cross section right here, this diamond point, and all of the other iterations there is some note. The Ronin comes out to the smallest, ittiest, bittiest quillins out here. The Dark Sword Armory has kind of meatier quillin tips out here. The Albion is the most symmetrical, I think, the most consistent in terms of the central ridge being crisp and prominent and not wavering. The Ronin wavers around a little bit. The lines are muddy. It's difficult to make out this kind of diamond section here. Well, it's not difficult to make it out, but at least you can tell it's not as crisp and clean as it is on the Albion. The Lucas piece, again, is also quite nice. It doesn't have the same refinement in my personal view as the Albion does, but it is clean and nice and well executed. It's hand ground, and I suppose there's some hallmarks of handmadeness here that are excusable. It's not exactly like it's bad. The central ridge is crisp. The lines don't seem to wave around, but in contrast, next to this Albion piece, personally, I think the Albion did the best job on the crossguard here, at least aesthetically speaking. They do all have some similar bits, though. Again, this flat near the bottom. This central ridge, I think, ties in really well with the grip on the Albion. The others don't have it so much. The Dark Sword Armory, if I compare and contrast these two, the Ronin made an attempt to similarly have a similar crossguard to the Harriet Dean piece or the Alexandria Armory sword, and while it's muddy, I think the historical example is far muddier. So it's not necessarily that this is bad, and it's certainly a closer representation of the historical piece. The Dark Sword Armory piece, if it was going to look like this on the Ronin, I don't necessarily think this is bad. Aesthetically, it pays homage to the shape on the sword that it's referencing, but it does certainly miss the mark. It doesn't have the same aesthetic kind of properties as the others do. I can't say I necessarily mind it, and I'm sure there's some historical variety with a different crossguard that's similar to this, so I don't think it's inappropriate on this particular sword at all, but you can see it's a little simpler design, though it also is worth noting that the Dark Sword is not a satin polish. It's mirrored. It has a higher grain of polish than any of the others, though to my eye, I believe the Albion seems to do it a little bit better. The way the light hits it, the way the lines appear crisp but soft enough not to cut your fingers on. Overall, that's my personal pick. The Ronin is probably closest to the historic example with the asymmetry and wavery lines, and the Lucas piece is also well done. The Dark Sword Armory, while it's shinier, I certainly don't mind the mirror polish. I would have liked to see something with the central ridge in it, though. If that's an important factor to you, now you know. I don't necessarily think aesthetically any of them are bad. Now, forgive the shaky video here. I'm going to attempt to show you the gap in the crossguard, and we'll look at who did it best. Now, this Ronin Katana, honestly, I think this is one of the best executed Ronin Katana crossguard gaps that I've seen. It's not huge. You can make out some small areas of improvement. There's a millimeter or two on this side, and you can certainly make out the gap area along this space here. There is a gap, though it is small, and you can make out along where the edges met. There's some additional spaces there. The Dark Sword Armory piece has larger gaps. Now, this is a hollow ground blade, and so the hollow ground area is probably a little more difficult to get fit in, but you can see where the hollow ground blade is meeting the crossguard. There's pretty large gaps under there. They look clean. I don't see a bunch of schmutz and nasty bits, and we have a slightly larger area where the edge is meeting the crossguard. Certainly not bad, but I think the worst of the bunch. The Albion, again, very consistent. Small, narrow gap, not a very prominent area along where the edge meets the crossguard. Those are quite small. Now, the blade from Lucas also has spots along the edge, but they're not as deeply cut, so it almost looks a little bit more intentional and aesthetically pleasing. There are some notable gaps along where the crossguard meets the edge, but really they're quite small. And again, this is handmade. This is probably the best example on a custom or handmade sword. Very often this gap is quite large. I wouldn't say it's as good as the Albion, but it's very similar to some Albion pieces. Is really one of the better pieces that I've seen from a custom swordsmith. Anyway, the gap is certainly notable. It's there, it's present, but it's not as pronounced as, say, the Dark Sword Armory, who I think has the largest gap on any of the swords shown here. Now we can contrast the blades, at least in general profile. I will include links in the weapon to the Weapon Dynamics computer below, as well as include measurements to each in the description down below, so you're able to discern the difference. The Ronin, I can tell you, is, I believe, the widest of them at the base, though they're all very, very similar in terms of the width. Notable differences: the Ronin Katana probably has a slightly brighter polish or shinier polish than the Albion, which has, I believe, the kind of the most satin-looking polish. Lucas and Albion both have, I would say, similar polish types in terms of the level of shininess or the grit used. The Dark Sword Armory is the kind of closest to a mirror polish. I wouldn't say it is a mirror polish, and forgive it, there are oil on all of these blades, so they are not as shiny and beautiful as they could be if they weren't in oil, but I'm messy and I don't want them to rust. The Ronin Katana has this engraving in it. The Dark Sword Armory will have something available like that in the future, and if you order one from a custom smith, presumably you could get that feature added. I've seen it on custom iterations, though presumably it will cost more money. Notable difference here: the Dark Sword Armory is actually a hollow ground blade. It doesn't have a diamond cross section like the other pieces do. Just about all of them have a very kind of subtle central ridge. The Lucas and Albion pieces have kind of the crispest, most discerning central ridge. The Ronin wavers a little bit, and it becomes more or less subtle as you move down the blade. The Dark Sword Armory piece has a pronounced central ridge, though it's also an effect of it being hollow ground, that meaning that this area here is cut out slightly, and it reduces the weight of the blade, presumably by doing this hollow ground effect. You can see along the Ronin Katana the central ridge is present, but it wavers slightly. There's more surface ripples in the blade than on most of the others, and the central ridge is less pronounced. The Dark Sword Armory has a very pronounced central ridge. The hollow ground is very apparent. Relatively few ripples in the blade as well. I mean, they're present, but it's not terrible. The Albion, reasonably well polished, plenty of surface ripples, but they're probably the more subtle than the rest of the blades presented. Central ridge doesn't waver. It's very consistent and well done. The piece by Lucas unquestionably has the best polish. It is flat and smooth, similar almost to a Japanese type katana. How this is polished is really excellent. It's the only one that doesn't have surface ripples or anything like that. It's really, as the plane of the blades, as far as the planes of the blade are concerned, certainly the best. I know this is not the best view, but it's about as close as I'm able to get so that you can see them lined up next to each other and get different ideas or views of the blade profiles and how they might be different and all of that malarkey. So you can see the Ronin Katana almost has the meatiest, chunkiest, and is pretty much the longest of the blades. Again, measurements and all that will be provided in the description down below. I've done my best to line up the cross guards on the plane. I used one of those planks down there, the seam on the wood there to line everything up. Anyway, so you can see the Ronin Katana looks the chunkiest. It's not necessarily the heaviest blade, though you might suspect it to be. It has kind of the longest look, but one of the shorter handles. The Dark Sword Armory piece seems to have the shortest blade. It's hollow ground and among the longer handles. The Albion has a similarly long blade to the Ronin, not quite as long. It's actually heavier than the Ronin. Handles are similar lengths, and the piece by Lucas over here has among the long blades, and a relatively long handle as well, making it, I think, overall the longest if you include the length of the handle. Hopefully the camera is able to hear me. I'm going to kind of twist them around a little bit individually, and hopefully you will be able to see. You can see there's not a substantial distal taper on the blade from Lucas. There is, again, measurements will be provided below. You'll be able to see there is a distal taper, though it is, at a glance here, not necessarily significant, and it has a dynamic feeling that feels, I think he really captured the way this sword feels. It's really a pretty nimble sword for as beefy as it is. The Albion sword, none of these really thin out to an itty-bitty tip, though the Albion seems to visually have one of the thinner blades. It also has, I think, inherently maybe the most flex to it out of any of these blades. It's, I think, captures the aesthetic and certainly the feel. I can move this in one hand if I want, though two is certainly better. It wants to jump away from you when you swing it into things. But it has maybe the most flexible blade out of any of the examples provided here. The Dark Sword Armory blade seems to achieve what it's going for by way of hollow ground. I don't see a significant distal taper in the blade. It's not terribly flexible, and if I hold it, it feels like I can move it around in one hand, though it's not as comfortable to move in one hand as the Albion example is. And the Ronin is the chunky of the examples shown here. It's the most kind of tip heavy, the most uncomfortable to hold in one hand. The blade has flex to it, I would say less than the Albion does. Definitely want to move it with two hands, though that grip does not give you a ton of room to do so. Now I'm going to talk for just a moment about the scabbards as they come with the blades. Now first I'm going to just talk about the piece from for the Lucas sword. It's a custom made scabbard with a wooden core. It's the best scabbard out of the mix. It doesn't have a metal shape on it yet, though that is something that I believe the owner intends to add. Sword friend Corey noted that he wanted to add a shape to one of these. The stitching is kind of the easiest to spot, though it looks even and well done. The risers are nice. The most attention to detail and the most character present on any of the scabbards in my mind is this handmade piece here. The contrast in color, the risers, the look, even the way it's worn and maybe the imperfections just add the character of this in a way that I don't think is true of the other pieces. But it's the most expensive and it's custom, and presumably you could have one of these made for any sword that you buy if you want one a custom scabbard made. They come certainly more elaborate than this. If you so choose, they can be much more expensive than the sword. And anyway, there we go. I'm not going to harp on this one too much because it's a custom piece and you can have the sky's the limit as far as custom pieces go. I think the main point to contrast between scabbards is between the Ronin Euro War Sword number 3 and the Dark Sword Armory. Both come with a wooden core scabbard, and the Ronin comes with a belt, so does the Dark Sword Armory. There's obviously about $100 difference between the two pieces in terms of cost if you were to both get them with similar belt systems and all that. The Dark Sword Armory piece seems to be made of better leather. As I feel it in my hand, it feels like a higher quality of leather. It also, the Ronin is soft and you might be able to see it move under my fingers. The Dark Sword Armory is kind of glued on there in such a way that it doesn't move. I can make out a seam along the side. The seam is on the back of the Dark Sword Armory piece. The Dark Sword Armory has these little riser bits in the scabbard. The Ronin has some more or less to hold the belt system on, but they don't have the same kind of aesthetic embellishments and such on the scabbard itself. We also have these little flaps here. I can't remember exactly what they are. They keep water out. Some such thing. The Ronin does not. And across the mouth, the Ronin is covered in leather. The Dark Sword Armory piece isn't. It rises up. But you can see it's pretty clean in there. And then, last but not least, both have a metal shape, kind of the inverse of each other. The Ronin is a little sharper. If I had to poke somebody, I guess I'd prefer the Ronin one. But a little more dimension, a central ridge. Overall, I think the Dark Sword Armory has a better shape in my mind, though there's a more pronounced ledge between the two. The Ronin fitting lines up a little I think it's less likely to catch on things perhaps than the Dark Sword Armory piece. Here I can get my finger in here and it would potentially snag on something like that. Not to say this couldn't be addressed, but the Ronin Katana doesn't feel like there's any sharp ledges or anything that would necessarily catch. Now I just want to touch on each sword individually, things that I suppose I like about it. I may have mentioned them in the course of this video, I may not have, but this particular one, the Ronin, aesthetically it captures what the sword's supposed to look like. If I look at the Harriet Dean sword, the Alexandria Sword, at the Met, this seems to capture that aesthetic, but dynamically I think it misses the mark, at least as I compare it to the other examples here. This sword is the most cumbersome, the least fun to hold in one hand. It's rough to swing in two. It didn't come particularly sharp, so cutting wise I can't say I really gave it an entirely fair shake. The geometry is suitable to take a better edge. I never put one on. I'm somewhat new to sharpening and I would make it messy and ugly, as you will see in a blade coming up. So I never actually gave it a good edge sharpening, but I'm pretty confident that if you got one and addressed the edge sharpness, that you'd be able to sail through some tatami mats, but it's going to give you an uncomfortable experience, at least more so than the other swords shown here. That said, if you like the kind of big, meaty, awesome thickness of the blade and you want something at the least expensive price, I've seen these for around 350 bucks on Ronin's website, or 450 bucks. Anyway, regardless of what price you find it at, it certainly is the least expensive option of the swords that I'm showing you here today. And there's nothing effectively wrong with it. I just say the main culprit, the main problem that I would have with this really isn't any aesthetic point I mentioned. It's just that dynamically speaking, it's pretty rough. It doesn't feel very good in the hand, especially not as I compare it to the others. It doesn't feel like it has the same sense of point control. It's a little more tip heavy. It's just not a very fun sword to move around. It could, but I would say at least it pales in comparison to the other ones. The Dark Sword Armory piece. Long and the short of it is this one is the less expensive option, at least as I compare it among the four. $580 isn't cheap, but as I look at the $350, $450 Ronin Katana iteration, this one gives you some of the dynamic capabilities of the sword. It's aesthetically, I think, misses the mark. The long handle, the lack of the etching, the hollow ground, the smaller blade, it doesn't have the same imposing look to it, I think, that the Ronin piece does, but it does give you the sense of dynamic feeling that you're hoping for. The longer handle probably aids with that. The hollow ground blade pulls some of the weight out, and in my hand it actually feels like a very nimble and fun sword. It's also got a higher grit polish on all of the fittings as well as the blade itself, and so it's a very handsome and nice sword. And if you are looking for an inexpensive sword but you still want to preserve some of the handling characteristics, this one seems nice. Now also note that the sharp one didn't necessarily come super sharp. I did try to sharpen it. I've mangled the blade and made it uglier. You can kind of make out where I've attempted to sharpen one edge here. It's done the job. It's sharper, but I never really quite got it where it needed to go. But again, I suck at sharpening and I'm pretty new to it. Anyway, dynamically, it's cheap and actually feels pretty good in the hand. How well it'll hold up, I don't honestly know. I do know that the Ronin Katana products stand up to a pretty heavy beating. I've put them through the paces, though not this sword in particular, but many of their other products. Dark Sword Armory, I guess I haven't done the review on it yet, so I'm hopeful, but I suppose, am I super confident in its ability to hold up to what this sword historically should have been capable of doing? I don't know, but depending on when you watch this, there may be a review to follow that will give you that information. The Albion. Well, I've given my thoughts and review on this sword. It is beautiful and wonderful. Dynamically speaking, it feels excellent in the hand. Out of all of the swords, actually, this probably feels the most capable to be wielded in one-handed while still having a relatively imposing and large sword. I believe it's 3 pounds 10 ounces, if I could recall, which is not something that should feel as good in one hand as this does. Obviously, swinging it around was a different story for me. Moving it, my hands get pretty uncomfortable in this relatively small grip, and I end up grabbing the pommel, and this is rather large even for my sausage hands, and it flings around. My fingernails get caught in this little recess area here. Moving the sword and actually cutting with it aren't terribly comfortable for me. I never really got the hang of it. Though I did find my stride in cutting. It came from Albion with this level of sharpness, which is suitable to do tatami cutting, but if you want to put a razor edge on it to excel even more, then you'll probably have to do that. I haven't done that because I didn't want to diminish the polish on the sword. As I've noted with the other two swords, I kind of suck at polishing it. Anyway, handsome sword, feels amazing in the hand. At $1,200, it's pretty good, but you're going to need a scabbard as well, at least if that's in your plan. So plan on that. In terms of pricing, this is not inexpensive, but it's certainly less expensive than the custom variety. Gives you the dynamics and overall aesthetic construction qualities that maybe you're hoping for. Lastly, the custom piece by Lucas here. This is frankly just an amazing sword and the best Type 18C that I've ever had the pleasure of holding. Dynamically speaking, it's a little more robust and heavy than the Albion iteration, but it came with an edge that just sailed through tatami. It moves, it's controllable. Lucas captured kind of the idea of how this sword is supposed to feel and what it's supposed to do. It's pretty rigid for its size. It's not terribly heavy. It's more cumbersome to move than the Albion, but in the cut it doesn't actually feel that way. I was able to hang on to the sword. It didn't present me with any level of discomfort at any time, other than the fact that this is not my sword and it's very expensive and I didn't want to whack the tip into concrete or anything like that. So apart from that, this is an amazing piece. If you have the budget to spend $5,000, $4,000, something like that on a sword, this would certainly be the choice. In every conceivable way, this one was superior. There were some aesthetic differences that were maybe less crisp and clean than the Albion, but overall I think it's still in the same realm of aesthetically as close to perfect as you want to get. The polish on it is really clean and well done as well, and in just about every way this one is my favorite, especially as I hold it in my hand. Sending it back to Corey, it's gonna be painful. That's about all I have for you, sword friends. I hope you have enjoyed the video. Special thanks to iPost Swords for taking the time to contribute to this video, to add some stuff to the Type 18C typology and give us all some good history goodness. Special thanks as well to sword friend Corey, who let me hang on to the Type 18C blade from Lucas. That's a very expensive sword, and he was gracious enough to let me hang on to it to make this video and compare and contrast it with, well, the rest of the sword so that you could benefit from it. And again, thanks to Dark Sword Armory for sending the prototype over to me so that I can break it. I haven't done that yet, but depending on when you watch this, there will be another video that follows and you'll get to see that. So thank you to them for sending that one over as well. Anyway, lots of contributions to this video. I hope you have enjoyed it. It's been fun for me to make, and as always, cheers and thanks for watching.